Thank you for visiting my channel. Before we start, please hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified of future presentations. Our topic for today is emergency rule in tort law. Consider these situations. A driver swerves to avoid hitting a child who suddenly runs across the road and in so doing accidentally rams into a house on the side of the road, causing damage thereto. Or, a man breaks into a house to rescue a child who is trapped inside and in so doing causes damage to the property. Would he be liable for the damage caused in the course of the rescue? In the case of the car that swerved to avoid hitting a child and in so doing accidentally rams into a house, the driver may invoke the emergency rule and argue that his actions were necessary and reasonable given the emergency situation and that he should not be held liable for the resulting damage to the house. The emergency rule is a legal principle in tort law that allows individuals to take necessary actions to protect themselves or others during an emergency situation without being held liable for any resulting harm or injury. The emergency rule recognizes that individuals may be forced to act quickly in emergency situations to avoid harm to themselves or others, and may not have the time or opportunity to consider all the possible risks and consequences of their actions. This rule allows individuals to take certain actions that would otherwise be considered illegal during emergency situations where there is an immediate danger to life or property and there is no time to obtain permission or consent from the owner of the property or the person affected. In tort law, the emergency rule is a defense that may be used by a defendant to claim that their actions were reasonable under the circumstances, even if they resulted in harm to another person. This defense is based on the principle that individuals may act in ways that would not be considered reasonable under normal circumstances when faced with an emergency situation. Under the emergency rule, a defendant may be excused from liability for their actions if they can demonstrate that they were acting in response to an emergency situation and that their actions were reasonable and in good faith given the circumstances. This defense can be used in a variety of tort cases, including negligence, intentional torts, and strict liability. Under the emergency rule, individuals are held to a lower standard of care than in ordinary circumstances. They are only required to act as a reasonably prudent person would under similar emergency circumstances and are not expected to use the same level of care and caution that would be required in non-emergency situations. If their actions are found to be reasonable under the circumstances, they will not be held liable for any harm or injury that results. To successfully invoke the emergency rule, a defendant must show that he acted reasonably under the circumstances. This may involve demonstrating that he acted in good faith, with a sincere desire to help others and minimize harm, and that his actions were proportional to the emergency situation. It is important to note, however, that the emergency rule does not provide blanket immunity from liability for any and all actions taken during an emergency situation. Rather, it is a limited defense that applies only to actions taken in response to an immediate and unforeseen emergency and only to the extent necessary to prevent harm to oneself or others. The reasonableness of the individual's actions will be assessed based on the specific circumstances of the emergency situation. One case where the emergency rule was applied is the case of Gunn versus CA. To avoid a head-on collision with the oncoming vehicle, Gunn swerved her car to the right and, as a consequence, hit an old man who was about to cross the road. The old man sustained injuries and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital where he was brought. Gunn was charged and found guilty of the crime of homicide through simple imprudence. The Supreme Court, however, reversed the decision, saying, "The test for determining whether or not a person is negligent in doing an act whereby injury or damage results to the person or property of another is this: Would a prudent man in the position of the person to whom negligence is attributed foresee harm to the person injured as a reasonable consequence of the course about to be pursued? If so, the law imposes the duty on the doer to take precaution against its mischievous results, and the failure to do so constitutes negligence. A corollary rule is what is known in law as the emergency rule. Under that rule, one who suddenly finds himself in a place of danger and is required to act without time to consider the best means that may be adopted to avoid the impending danger is not guilty of negligence if he fails to adopt what subsequently and upon reflection may appear to have been a better method, unless the emergency in which he finds himself is brought about by his own negligence. The emergency rule, however, is not applicable if the tortfeasor himself created the emergency. The emergency rule cannot be invoked if the person invoking it found himself in danger or in an emergency which he himself created through his own negligence. In one case, the Supreme Court held, while the general rule is that a driver is not held accountable just because he failed to take the wisest choice in a sudden emergency, the rule does not apply where the emergency is of the driver's own creation or devising. In that case, the driver was overspeeding when he hit a pedestrian who suddenly darted across the street. The Supreme Court held that the emergency rule does not apply in this case because the danger or emergency was created by the driver himself through his own negligence. The citation of the case is cited below. If you find this presentation helpful, please hit the subscribe button to receive notification of future presentations. Thank you.